Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me. So my name is John Mutchek. I'm a cloud solution architect with Microsoft. I've been at Microsoft for about 14 years now in a variety of different roles, but primarily working with larger our enterprise customers in New England. I'm based here out of Connecticut, and I've been working specifically with Azure in the cloud since it was born. So for quite some time. And, given the sort of state of things over the last couple of years, we've seen a huge acceleration in the number of companies moving towards the cloud, towards Azure, migrating existing applications or building applications. And so one of the things over the last, say, 6 months that I find myself doing more and more is working with companies around how do they transition not just the application, but sort of how do they think about managing and building applications in Azure to get the most out of that platform. So what I had prepared was just to spend a little bit of time talking about the framework that we have put in place, and other cloud providers have done similar things in order to try to help with that transition. It's part technology, but it's part process and people as well. But mostly, we're a small group. So if you have questions, you want to talk about something else related to Azure, I often say there is no such thing as an Azure expert because it's just too big of a platform. But I've worked with it for some time, and I'd be happy to take other topics, other questions, other things you might have on your mind about the Microsoft platform. So hopefully that is, that's not doing anything, so I'll do this. That's not doing anything. There we go. So I was going to spend a little time talk about sort of why I think this is a good topic for today. What is the WellArchitected framework, and how to get started with it, some resources that you can use. So the big impetus for me here is that I worked with a lot of different companies now on building new applications for Azure, also taking existing applications and moving to Azure, everything from what we would call a lift and shift, pick up a data center or part of a data center and move it into the cloud. I've worked with companies that have already done that, maybe are using AWS or GCP or Azure, and they've primarily picked up, say, 1,000 servers or 5,000 servers and moved them into Azure because that's the fastest and easiest way to transition. A lot of times these are driven by things like, hey, I want to stop paying lease on a data center, or I want to stop paying for this colo. I'd rather move to the cloud model. And so it's a bridge. It's a first step that a lot of companies take. When they do that, after 6 months or a year, they often will come back and say, hey, it turns out that running in the cloud is different than running on-prem. And again, I get this question, whether or not you're talking about Azure or AWS or another, it really doesn't matter. Each of those hyperscale clouds is different in and of itself, but they are all, I would say, universally different than running in a traditional data center. We do a lot of things to sort of mask that for your first journey into the cloud, right? You can host a virtual machine. That virtual machine looks an awful lot like one that you would run on VMware on-prem. You can, in fact, there are tools to just pick up an existing VM and move it into the cloud, right? And you host it on a virtual network with things, like VNets and subnets that are similar, but not exactly the same to things like VLANs running on-prem, right? We sort of put up this wall that says, this is our part of the responsibility is to manage the network and the infrastructure itself, and your part is to manage the configuration. But as you get experience with it, you learn that it's actually quite a bit more than that. And so this type of complexity, I find, really does create friction between expectations of what we were going to get when we move to AWS or when we move to Azure. And how we were going to apply our existing tools and processes and systems to manage that. And so I see struggle where that those initial steps are often to try to move as much as of my existing property into a cloud as quickly as possible without changing the tools and the process that I use to manage it. And that can cause some real disconnect. And it works, right? I'm not here to tell you that those tools don't work. And in fact, oftentimes, Microsoft will say that is the fastest and the easiest way to get going. Don't change your tools. Just keep using the same kind of security and networking tools that you're using on-prem as you move to the cloud. And it does work. What it does is it also creates a cap as to how much value ultimately you'll be able to get out of the platform, because you're sort of bringing some baggage, some legacy with you that's no longer necessary. And so this second bullet around operating compatibility is huge. We make a lot of, we've trained ourselves, we learned how to run an IT shop for years and years, and we're good at it, right? We're good at running a data center. We're good at sort of managing our towers. We have the server tower, the networking tower, the storage tower. We have different teams, we have different specialties. We use things like, like ITSM and well-known standard models for operating that environment. And again, yet when we move to the cloud, we find that some of those actually don't work the same, or they don't apply. And so there's more that we need to do. All of this does ultimately then make it very difficult for a customer to trust a cloud, any cloud, where the primary underlying conceit of the cloud is that of this shared responsibility model, right? You do your part, we'll do our part, and we'll get there together. If all of your old tools, if the things that you're familiar with are no longer sort of part of that equation, I need to trust that first before I can trust the cloud. And so these alternatives, this friction that we create, really does impact the applications themselves. It impacts our ability to get the most out of whatever cloud we've chosen to use. And I think that's what's driven a lot of this focus on what we call well-architected. I personally have seen, like I've worked with customers that have gone through this process where you are either already in the cloud, but potentially experiencing, it's more expensive than I thought it was going to be, right? I thought I was going to save a lot of money by going to the cloud. And actually it turns out I'm not. In my mind, in my experience, it's always, I'm not yet. And it's often because I've carried with me some old assumptions about how I do business on-prem, and that I still need to do it that way in the cloud. And in the worst case, it leads to things like security vulnerabilities. It leads to gaps that you see in the news that none of us want to be a part of, because we didn't really truly understand what it meant to configure a cloud for secure operations. And we assumed that if we built a big network firewall and we built the defenses around the perimeter, that we would be okay. And the truth is that is no longer adequate. Well-architected is actually a bunch of things. If you look at our documentation, this is a good place to start. Go to the Azure Architecture Center. There's an enormous amount of content out there around how to best practices for architecting applications and infrastructure. So documentation, reference architectures, certainly we have partners that are very experienced, and as well as our support organization, in how to help build these environments. But what I want to talk a little bit about is how we materialize these recommendations, right? You've got documentation, you can sit out there for hours and read it. The real question is, how do I turn that into, how do I actually apply it to my application? The WAF, or Well-Architected Framework, not to be confused with Web Application Firewall, because there are only so many letters in the English language, is comprised of five pillars. This is pretty standard, again, across, I think, hypercloud industry. I actually always start with reliability, because that is, I think, oftentimes what customers are primarily concerned about first. I want to make sure that this application isn't going to fail on me. Reliability and security, I guess I would say, are tied for first. But the nice thing about reliability is that it gives us the groundwork to talk about your application, to talk about, well, what does it do? Who interacts with it? What components does it use? What external dependencies does it have? And from there, we're able to then start talking about, well, then how am I going to secure it, right? How do you operate it? How do we make sure that we keep the costs down? So across these five pillars, we're trying to identify and communicate what are the common things that will keep you back. What are the common things that will break? What are the common things you might overlook? And so again, let's use reliability as the example today, because that is the one that I think ends up getting a lot of attention, is just understanding the individual services that I'm using. I've deployed virtual machines into Azure. Okay, well, do you understand how the SLAs work on virtual machines depending upon their configuration? What about the underlying storage that those VMs are using in the networks? The networks are configured with virtual appliances that I might be using to do data exfiltration scanning or inbound request filtering, or even just logging for audit purposes. Well, what's the reliability of those virtual appliances as they're deployed in Azure, right? Where are the individual single points of failure that I may hit? And have I tested for those, right? We call it reliability. I think at one point this pillar might have even been called resiliency. And I see one as the evolution to the other. First, we have to make sure that we've deployed the application in a reliable way. Once we've done that, we can actually start to build into the application resiliency. Expect that any one of those components are going to fail. How am I going to respond to it? How does the application respond to it? How do we move past that? So these are just some of the things we're trying to avoid. And sometimes, depending on your specific situation, you may already have an application in Azure and say, hey, it's costing me more than I think it should. Okay, well then let's just go right to the cost optimization pillar. Let's start there. So oftentimes, one confusion that I've heard around well-architected framework is the assumption that it's all 5 of these pillars. And for a mission critical application, yeah, it probably is. Not all in one day, not all in 1 week, but over some period of time. But we start where you need to start, right? Is it, no, actually right now, I really have to get a handle on cost. Okay, let's talk about reserved instances and capacity and elasticity. Let's talk about your non-production environments and how those are may or may not be optimized for cost. And oftentimes there's a lot we can do just in one individual pillar, but they all blend together a little bit too, right? Some things that you might do for cost optimization, you might stop and say, hey, wait a second, actually, I'm spending that money because of a security requirement that I have in place, for example. Or sure, I could make this environment cheaper by having less redundancy, but now I'm not going to meet my reliability goals, right? So those are it's common sense, but we can manage them independently. And as we work through each of the pillars, we're going to drive essentially an alignment to best practices. These come from a decade of us working with customers building and deploying solutions in Azure. I'll be the first to admit that for early years of Azure, we didn't have great guidance. I don't think anybody had great guidance because we were all learning, what does it actually mean? How do you deploy an application in a hyperscale cloud, and what works and what doesn't work? I think we've gotten much better at that. I think we've learned and we've actually heard, we've gotten a lot of these best practices from our customers and said, hey, we tried this, it didn't work. We've been trying this, we're working with your engineering teams, and we know now that this is a better way to go. And so we document that as part of the well-architected framework. So how do you do it? There's really two patterns here. If you have a brand new application that you're looking to deploy into Azure, then that's a great time to include the well-architected framework. It's actually the best time, right? Let's go, and before you start deploying, let's look at the whiteboard. Let's look at your designs and your diagrams, how you intend to deploy, and let's influence change there, right? Let's make sure that your design is aligned with best practice. And in some cases, even more importantly, let's make sure that it's aligned with not just our best practices for configuration and deployment, but our strategy for Azure, right? How are we investing? What are the parts of this platform that are evolving? What direction are they evolving in? So that you're not deploying an architecture that maybe ends up being sort of stranded because you're not taking advantage of the evolution of the platform itself. But I will say more often than not, the well-architected framework gains attention and captures the spotlight on existing workloads. I've already deployed something to Azure, and as I said, maybe this is more expensive than I thought it would be, or I would like to reduce the costs now that we have it up and running. I've heard we've had this application running up in Azure for a couple of years now. The original team is gone. We don't know exactly what it does. This is, I think, a story that plays out over and over, even on-prem, right? So tell us, Microsoft, like, are we doing it right? Okay, well, that's a very difficult answer, question to answer without diving deeper into the application itself. So the WAF is a great framework for doing that. Like I said, I usually start with reliability. Let's look at your architecture diagram. Let's determine if it's up to date. Let's look at all the individual components that make up this application and determine, are they configured to give you the reliability that you are expecting? Oftentimes the answer is no. I thought I was going to get 4 nines of availability, but it turns out you've only deployed 1 VM, without the right storage configuration. And so even Microsoft isn't going to make that financial commitment. We're not going to guarantee that that is going to be up that long. In some cases, we find that there's just a fundamental misunderstanding about how does that division of labor work, right? If I've deployed a Kubernetes cluster and I'm deploying applicate container images out into that run my application, and I've had customers that make the assumption that Microsoft has been patching those container images all along. Well, no, that actually falls on your side of the shared responsibility. We're patching the infrastructure and the nodes, you're patching the application. And so we want to find those places where we have a poor alignment with best practices, or in some cases, just a misunderstanding of how the service works. So those are really the 2 ways that you can engage with the WAF. If you have a new project that's coming or in the process of spinning up, or even, maybe you're 6 months from go live or 90 days from go live, might be a good time to go and double check and say, hey, are we doing this in a reliable fashion? Are we doing this in a secure fashion? How are we going to actually operate it? There's a lot of ways that you can do this. There are, from a first-party perspective, Microsoft and solution architects like myself are available to help run workshops. Also, we have customer engineers that are certified to go through and run each of these pillars with you. And that can be anything from, I'll do 90 minutes once or twice a week for 4 or 6 weeks, if that's what the team availability is, to sort of walk through one of these pillars. Or it could be a 3-day intensive workshop in front of a whiteboard where we go through a complex application. Simple apps aren't going to require that much time, but if it's a mission critical major application, it could easily require that much time just to go through reliability. What are all the components of this application? How are they being used? How are they configured? How does that align to best practices? And so this is something that you can either get sort of a detailed intensive workshop through your unified or premier support agreement, but also, especially in the cases of new applications, new deployments into Azure, then you can also often reach out to your account team and get a solution architect aligned for, like I said, maybe 1 or 2 days, or for a longer period of time spread out. And that's something that then Microsoft funds. So it's a way for Microsoft to have Microsoft at the table with your application team, with your infrastructure team, to help answer those questions and make sure they're heading in the right direction or getting started in the right direction. If it's a 3-day workshop, ultimately you will work with you to build the agenda. Using reliability as an example, again, these are the types of conversations that we're going to have. Let's say I'm running that 90-minute session for 4 or 6 weeks. These are the topics every week, right? I'm going to spend some time just understanding the architecture. And so we need to make sure that we have the right team on the call to do that. We want to understand how you've built a model for health for your application. How do you know if it's healthy? Is it just, that you've got a single green light that says that the website is up? Or how much other application level monitoring do I have in place? Am I running proactive, preemptive, synthetic transactions through the application from an external source so that I sort of can imitate what the customer is seeing and learn from that? What are your backup and recovery procedures? What are your requirements for SLA, for disaster recovery? What are your RPO and RTO? All of those come into play when we talk about whether or not your application can, as designed or as built, can meet the reliability expectations of the business. how are you testing the application? So this could be, again, it could be an intensive sort of 3 days. This sort of builds the agenda from here, or we'll pick one of these topics every week and review them with the appropriate teams. Ultimately, what we want to do in those, let's say 3 days, we haven't fixed all the problems, right? What we've done is to help identify and prioritize them. So we're comparing as built or as designed against best practices, come out with a proposed list of actions. Ideally, that ends up in the team's backlog, right? I now have a list of things that I know we need to do in the environment, and we're going to schedule those depending upon the criticality. There are things that we need to do immediately or maybe before go live, or hey, these are things that we're going to integrate into phase 2 of the application after it goes live, but they're things we don't want to lose track of. And then again, you can work with your customer success, your account manager, to help coordinate and schedule those if you need to bring in additional expertise from Microsoft, other customer engineers to help your team do the configuration or actually implement some of these changes. And of course, you can always then align with a Microsoft partner to do the assessment and the deployment all as one package. Oops. There's a bunch of resources. I'm happy to share this. You can get it through Ron. Like I said, start with the Azure Architecture Center. There's actually a ton of content out there, not just around well-architected, but around patterns for cloud application design, around standards and blueprints for securing certain types of applications. For example, again, for Kubernetes, there's essentially a production baseline configuration for Azure Kubernetes out there if you're using AKS in the environment. These are really excellent resources, and they're actually ones that I use all the time when customers engage me directly for an hour or a day or a week to pull back and say, hey, I'm not inventing all of this stuff on my own, but we're really using the experience that comes from our existing customers. There's a couple other ways that you can leverage the well-architected framework. One is a bit more self-service. You do have access. We have an online tool. Again, as I think most cloud providers do, I'm working with a very large healthcare organization right now that's looked at all of them and actually chosen Microsoft's well-architected framework assessment tool to assess all of their Azure on-prem and workloads running in other clouds, just because they like sort of the assessment, and it's a pretty thorough, investigation into what you are and are not doing. And it doesn't necessarily apply just to Azure. But as you can see, you can go out here, you can find it on the web, and it's a questionnaire. It gives you, you can do either all 5 pillars or one of the pillars at a time. And it asks you essentially leading questions that align to best practices. And if the more yeses you accumulate, the better your score will be. Yes, I'm doing that. Yes, I'm already aware of that. Yes, I've made that decision. And the more blanks or no's that you accumulate, the lower your score will be. And then at the end, it actually does generate a list of prioritized recommendations. You should do these 10 things immediately. And then these are things you should have on your backlog. I think that it is a great place to start. It's not the end of the story, because when you come out of that assessment, you will have a score. I've had customers that are down in that critical red zone. They're not super happy with the score. And it requires then a little, let's go back and talk about these practices. Most of them in every case actually do apply to you. So don't fall into the trap of saying, well, these don't apply to me, so my score isn't accurate. They actually do, right? They apply to everybody. They are pretty universal. You may have chosen, for example, not to use Azure Firewall. Instead, you're going to use Palo Alto, or you're going to use another firewall appliance running in Azure. Okay, like that's fine, but you're satisfying the requirement in the best practice. So it's worth doing. You do this on a workload basis. Don't try to do it for your entire Azure environment. Don't try to do it for your even an entire subscription if you have lots of applications running in that subscription. But do it on a workload. And again, start with the most mission critical applications. I wouldn't expect you to go through and run an assessment like this on every little website that you stand up. But if it's a customer facing website, if it has sensitive data in it or is mission critical to your business, if it's an e-commerce, absolutely, those should be good targets here. And finally, on an ongoing basis, Azure does have a built-in tool called Azure Advisor that I hope you're familiar with. It can't cover the entire WellArchitected framework, but many of the automated rules and alerts, the scoring mechanism that's in Azure Advisor is actually pulling from WellArchitected. So if you do nothing else, starting from Azure Advisor is great because I can go in there and it's constantly looking at what you've actually deployed and can make recommendations across these pillars for opportunities for improvement. And often, sometimes it'll even give you a button to go fix the thing and apply the change. But if not, it at least points you to the documentation and tells you how to do it. So those are the tools. Like you can have Microsoft come in and help, especially with those bigger mission critical applications, or you could use a partner to come in and help lead an assessment and run the remediation. You can run your own assessment using the questionnaire and the online tool, or you can always continue to use Advisor to get your own sort of up-to-date view of what the deployment looks like. And this is all just data driven, right? One of the really cool things about deploying into a hyperscale cloud is that you get sort of, in some ways you get CMDB for free, right? As built is as queried, like what's out there is exactly what's running. And so I can use the resource graph in Azure and I can run queries. I can build this kind of analysis myself. I can easily build a dashboard that says, well, how many VMs are out there and how are they configured and how many firewalls, or where do I have public IP addresses deployed? It's all queryable, right? I don't have to maintain a separate list of websites I've deployed because Azure always knows, and you can query it. You can build dashboards, you can build reports, you can build alerts, so that you're actually interacting with the live environment. And that's what Advisor is doing behind the scenes. So that's WellArchitected framework. It's not really about technology until you start getting into the weeds of the review itself, but it is, it's increasingly the topic of conversation. Even discussions that come up with customers that don't start with WellArchitected framework often end there because it's hey, how can you help me do this better? Or what's Microsoft's opinion about XYZ? And wherever those are universally applicable across industries, across workloads, we try to embed it into the documentation such that that everybody can benefit. But I'm happy to answer any other questions either about this or about Azure or other Microsoft platform as much as I can, or that's what I had for you today.